The mysterious disappearance in Chicago. On a chilling autumn evening in 1989, the city of Chicago buzzed as always, a metropolis alive with energy, neon lights reflecting off skyscrapers, and the sound of trains rattling on the city's iconic elevated tracks. That night, at the Royal Lux Hotel, tucked away in the posh urban center, a high-profile meeting was taking place behind closed doors. Little did anyone know, it would mark the beginning of one of Chicago's most baffling criminal mysteries. The Royal Lux, a five-star slice of urban decadence, was known for its ritzy clientele, politicians, athletes, and yes, the occasional criminal underworld boss. On this particular night, Nathan Kingston, a powerful yet low-profile underground casino magnate, and his wife, the elegantly poised Marie Kingston, arrived at the hotel. Alongside them were three other notable figures, local crime syndicate leaders whose reputations preceded them in both fear and controversy. The nature of their meeting remained unknown to those outside the room, but rumors abounded of territory disputes and aggressive power grabs in Chicago's East Side gambling rackets. When the Kingstons failed to return home, their disappearance raised red flags almost immediately. Marie's closest friend and confidant, sensing something was wrong, reached out to the police. Strangely enough, this was not the first tip the authorities had received about the infamous Royal Lux that week. Residents nearby had filed noise complaints about strange bangs, for some, unmistakable gunshots, emanating from the hotel's third floor. Still, in a city like Chicago, where sounds of the night were both diverse and deceiving, the grievances were discounted as typical urban chaos. By the time the Kingstons were officially reported missing, the trail was already ice cold. Nonetheless, when police set foot in the Royal Lux to investigate, what they found haunted them. Room 318, a premier VIP suite, still carried faint echoes of violence barely scrubbed away. Bullet holes marred the silk-lined walls, and though someone had tried to clean the space thoroughly, chemical analysis revealed smeared traces of blood on the luxurious Persian carpeting. Even stranger, the cameras located in the high-security corridors of the hotel had seemingly malfunctioned that very evening, recording nothing useful. Hotel staff offered unconvincing accounts. Some claimed to have seen a reserved group enter the suite but were firm in their denial of having witnessed anything suspicious. Others whispered rumors unwilling to step forward officially of unregistered guests milling about during the hours in question, staring too long at the sinks or loading something heavy into large black bags. The most significant finding, however, lay not inside the room, but in the hotel's parking lot. Nathan's iconic 1985 black Cadillac, polished to perfection, sat eerily abandoned. Its driver's seat bore faint boot scuffs, hinting at a struggle, and the dashboard clock had been stopped, as if marking the precise moment ominous events occurred. The trunk? Completely clean. Too clean. Investigators suspected deliberate sanitization. Nevertheless, forensic specialists struggled to extract further clues. What truly baffled law enforcement was the utter lack of consistency in available evidence. Neighbors reported low voices and signs of entry on the upper floors that contradicted claims there was only one entry point open that night. Competing theories emerged almost immediately. Foul play connected to mob turf wars, the staging of a double homicide to send a message, or an expertly orchestrated runaway attempt. But the suspects remained elusive. The disappearance of the Kingstons and the three other mobsters quickly made headlines. "Power couple vanishes in downtown Chicago!" screamed the press, feeding public curiosity and spiraling conspiracy theories. Conversations around cafe tables and dive bars speculated a mafia hit gone wrong. Or perhaps gone way too right, given the lack of any substantial leads. The police, however, had their suspicions. All trails, no matter how faint, seemed to loop back to Billy Crowder, the enigmatic owner of the Royal Lux. Born into the shadowy underbelly of Chicago's South Side, Crowder was a man of calculated moves. While his public persona depicted a businessman running a legitimate hospitality empire, his past painted a far darker picture, a figure once deeply entrenched in smuggling and extortion schemes. On paper, Crowder had cleaned up his act to join Chicago's elite, but those in the know understood the rules. Cities like Chicago aren't built without deals being made in the dark. With media scrutiny mounting and political pressure increasing, Chicago police faced mounting hurdles. A lack of evidence, unwilling witnesses, and the suffocating influence of underworld connections rendered the entire case a tangled mess. The question lingered in the public consciousness. Were Nathan Kingston and his entourage targeted in a planned execution, Were they victims of betrayal, or had an even larger, more powerful hand swept them away into the void? What nobody could suspect at the time was just how complex, violent, and wide-reaching this disappearance would become. This was not merely a local police matter but the prelude to a twisted web of revenge, manipulation, and a thirst for power that would consume everyone involved. The Royal Lux would never be the same again, forever earning its moniker, the Hotel of Shadows. The Missing Persons File. The disappearance at the Royal Lux wasn't just another mob mystery, it was a disruption that echoed through the city's darkest alleys and brightest skylines. The 5 individuals who vanished into thin air that night each carried a turbulent legacy that bound them to whispers of crime, power, and danger. For the authorities, this wasn't just a missing persons case, it was the unraveling of a web, where every strand led to formidable players in Chicago's underworld. Nathan Kingston, the first and most notable, was no ordinary man. At 45, Nathan wasn't the type who reveled in ostentation. He preferred the shadows to the spotlight, only stepping out when it served his interests. Behind his low-profile persona lay one of Chicago's most lucrative underground gambling empires, stretching from exclusive East Side poker rooms to discreet betting operations buried in the suburbs' dive bars. But Nathan wasn't just wealthy, he was feared. Known by local crime syndicates as the Chess Master, his nickname spoke to his impeccable strategy and a knack for predicting his rivals' moves before they even thought to make them. Kingston was the kind of man who didn't get caught, by the law or by his enemies. So when he and his wife went missing, the streets talked. His wife, Marie Kingston, lived her life tethered to Nathan's shadow yet cast one of her own. At 39, Marie was stunning, articulate, and had a presence that melted away suspicion whenever she entered the upscale soirees she helped her husband organize. Actively working alongside Nathan to maintain the casino operation's veneer of legitimacy, Marie was a savvy networker. She entertained the city's elite, real estate moguls, influential lawyers, and yes, even a few public officials who turned a blind eye to her husband's illicit dealings. Marie wasn't just a wife, she was Nathan's confidant, ally, and in some ways, his shield. For her to disappear alongside him, that wasn't planned, it was war. The others who accompanied the Kingstons into oblivion that October night made the waters even murkier. Each was a prominent figure in Chicago's criminal underbelly, men who ruled their domains with an iron fist but with an air of calculated ruthlessness. First was Samuel "Sammy Two Eyes" Carvalho, a mid-level enforcer turned boss. His piercing blue stare, the signature behind the infamous nickname, struck fear into anyone unlucky enough to see him walking toward their front door uninvited. He oversaw West Side loan sharking operations with a cold efficiency, ensuring every cent owed came back multiplied. Sammy's power wasn't just in his fists or his guns, it was in his haunting ability to simply know things about everyone, weaknesses, debts, secrets. Then there was Mickey, the fixer Darrow, the man who could smooth out trouble where others saw chaos. Mickey wasn't loud or theatrical, instead his calm demeanor belied his true nature, a handler who made problems go away in the city's top circles. From falsified financial records to strategically lost pieces of evidence in court cases, Mickey's phone often rang before someone's life fell apart. If Nathan Kingston was the chess master, Mickey Darrow was the invisible hand resetting the board in his favor. Finally, Frederick Malone, commonly known among the ranks as Freddie Red, brought a raw brutality to the group that hadn't matched Chicago's usual elegance of organized crime. A recent arrival from Detroit, Freddie's reputation as a ruthless runner of smuggling networks preceded him. The red wasn't just a nod to his ginger hair, it reflected the bloodbath that often accompanied his arrival in new territories. Like many who walked into the Royal Lux Hotel that night, Freddie was rumored to have his eye on expanding his slice of the pie, and wasn't particular about who got cut in the process. What tied these 3 men together, and to the Kingstons, was part circumstance, part desperation. All 3 had taken substantial financial hits with Nathan Kingston's encroaching operations hammering their once thriving trades. Given the cooling-off periods they'd accepted during previous mob negotiations, no one expected to see these men willingly meet under one roof unless the stakes were nothing short of colossal. The missing persons file created by the Chicago PD painted vivid pictures of their lives and the potential motives behind their gatherings. But files don't tell the whole story. Nathan and Marie Kingston may have publicly maintained their composed partnership, but quiet rumors lingered in mob circles. They were growing increasingly isolated. Nathan's ambition, built like a house of cards, burned bridges faster than alliances could form. Sammy's empire, steady but fractured, struggled to outmaneuver his younger, hungrier rivals. Mickey, once indispensable as a problem solver, had recently fallen into debt with some highly dangerous people. As for Freddie Red, the city wasn't convinced he'd bowed out gracefully from the Detroit intrigue he left behind. By any measure, this joint venture screamed trouble. What added further complication was the lack of clarity surrounding their meeting. The room booked, the now infamous Room 318, was arranged under a fake name, paid with cash, and sealed off from any prying eyes. Potential witnesses were unlikely to step forward given the reputations of the attendees. Rumors swirled. Was this a secret truce brokered to navigate Chicago's recalibrating crime landscape? Or was it, as other whispers suggested, a setup? A chance for Kingston to cement himself as Chicago's undisputed kingpin at the expense of his rivals. Their collective disappearance wasn't just unheard of, it was dystopian. In a city where whispers in the alleys often hinted at potential outcomes days before they played out, no one had seen, or even guessed, that this alliance would vanish into nothingness. Each member was too cautious, too careful, and most importantly, too connected to simply disappear without a trace. Together, their sudden absence raised questions far weightier than any police detective could answer. The only truth that remained was their void. 5 colossal presences sucked out of the world as though erased by some unseen force. For Chicago, a city that routinely birthed legends of crime and order, it was a chilling moment. These weren't just 5 missing names tucked into classified reports. They were reminders of how power, when wielded in confidence or arrogance, can vanish without so much as a warning. Somewhere behind the gleaming facade of the Royal Lux's marbled hallways, answers lay buried, but uncovering them? That was a gamble no one dared make, at least, not yet. The mastermind behind it all. There were plenty of whispers on the darkened streets of Chicago, but one name kept surfacing with unsettling frequency. William "Billy" Crowder. To the city's upper echelons, Crowder appeared to be nothing more than a successful entrepreneur, a self-made man who ran the Royal Lux Hotel, along with a handful of upscale nightclubs dotted throughout Chicago's downtown. His establishments offered gilded walls, exotic cocktails, and the kind of exclusivity that drew politicians, celebrities, and business moguls into his orbit. But those who really knew Billy Crowder understood one thing: nothing in his world ran on chance or luck. Crowder wasn't just a hotelier, he was a tactician, a shadowy puppet master who knew how to play the game in ways others wouldn't dare. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, Billy came into the world with the deck stacked against him. His father, a struggling auto mechanic with a penchant for gambling, lost everything to loan sharks when Billy was just 12. The family home foreclosed and his father, unable to pay back the debts, vanished under suspicious circumstances one cold December night. Billy's mother, overcome with grief and alcoholism, became a ghost of herself. By the age of 15, Billy was living on the streets, surviving by peddling stolen watches and picking pockets on Chicago's bustling train platforms. What set Billy apart from your average street kid, however, was that he had vision. His charisma and knack for negotiation made him a natural at reading people, a skill he honed as he clawed his way into the lowest ranks of Chicago's notorious Southside gangs. By the time he turned 20, Billy was running small-time numbers rackets and overseeing backroom poker games in pool halls that stunk of cheap whiskey and cigarette smoke. But Billy wasn't content with pennies scraped from greasy tables. He saw the gaps in Chicago's criminal ecosystem and planned to fill them, one piece at a time. While other gang leaders were flashy, spending their earnings on gold watches and sports cars, Billy reinvested carefully. He bought failing bars, renovated them just enough to give them an air of respectability, and used them as stepping stones for his bigger ambitions. The real turning point came when he found his way into the city's underground smuggling network. Prohibition may have officially ended in 1933, but by the 1980s, Chicago was still a fertile ground for contraband, illegal arms, drugs, and counterfeit goods. Billy proved himself a logistical mastermind, setting up safe routes and foolproof handoffs that made his operations practically untouchable by law enforcement. By the time he reached 30, Crowder had moved beyond smuggling to larger, more sophisticated ventures: money laundering, black market real estate, and a string of legitimate businesses that served as fronts. One of those acquisitions was the Royal Lux Hotel, which, on its surface, was a posh 5-star retreat for Chicago's elite. But behind closed doors, It was a fortress for quiet deals and darker transactions. Room service buzzed with discreet champagne orders masking drug deliveries, and entire suites were transformed into impromptu safe houses for business associates who needed to disappear for a few days. Crowder didn't just run the hotel, he used it as a sanctuary, a stage, and sometimes a weapon. Billy's rise, however, wasn't without turbulence. There were countless power struggles along the way, some more violent than others. One incident in particular burned itself into Chicago's history books. In 1978, a rival gang lord named Frankie Bones Marquez declared an all-out war against Billy, determined to peel away his territory in the East Side, prime real estate for underground gambling dens. Frankie's men torched one of Billy's nightclubs and left a grisly message. The severed hand of one of his bartenders nailed to a wooden floor. Billy's response was surgical. Over the course of 2 weeks, Frankie's operations began collapsing one by one. Rumors circulated that Crowder had personally overseen the destruction of his rival's pipeline, taking out 3 top lieutenants in a series of accidents that were too clean to pin down but too strategic to ignore. By the time Frankie decided to sit down for a truce, he already knew what the outcome would be. Days after the meeting, Marquez's charred body was discovered in the trunk of an abandoned Cadillac outside Joliet. A bullet to the skull was the only clear evidence of what had transpired. Nobody dared cross Billy Crowder after that. Despite his violent past, Billy executed his operations with an unnerving calmness, as he transitioned into the legitimate business world. He played the part of the respectable hotelier perfectly, suits tailored by the best in New York, philanthropic donations that made headlines and polite appearances at city council events. But in reality, he operated like a mafia CEO, delegating the dirty work to a trusted inner circle while maintaining plausible deniability. His network of influence ran deep, spanning corrupt politicians, police officers, and even businessmen desperate to stay afloat in a cutthroat corporate landscape. By the late 1980s, whispers about Crowder's involvement in the darker side of Chicago had quieted, or at least that's what the public thought. When Nathan Kingston and the others vanished at the Royal Lux, the case seemed too coincidental to ignore. Investigators quickly realized how entangled Crowder's name was in the threads of the city's underworld. His hotel wasn't just the last place they were seen, it was the epicenter of power plays steeped in decades of blood and secrecy. But here's the thing about Billy Crowder, there was no evidence. Despite the suspicions, his records were clean, his staff loyal, and his enemies conveniently no longer around to testify. Rumors murmured that the surveillance cameras mysteriously malfunctioning on the night of the disappearance were no coincidence. Cops speculated whether Crowder had orchestrated the whole thing or simply allowed it to happen under his roof. Either way, one thing was certain. Nothing, and no one, moved in and out of the Royal Lux without Crowder's knowledge. What the police didn't yet understand was this. Billy Crowder wasn't some mob boss who folded under pressure. He thrived on control, thrived on the knowledge that while others fought for scraps, he was the one pulling the strings. Whether Nathan Kingston's ambitious overreach drove him to challenge Crowder, or whether the meeting was a calculated convergence of egos destined to combust, the truth remained shrouded. Crowder knew how to play Chicago like a grandmaster chess player, and if he was the mastermind behind that night, he had certainly covered his tracks well. As the media frenzy began speculating about Crowder's hand in the disappearances, he appeared unfazed. In an interview with the Chicago Tribune, he even dismissed the rumors with a chilling smile and an anecdote about his early days running a bar. "People love their stories," he said. "They're like drinks, you can pour them strong or keep them watered down. Either way, everyone will pay to hear them." If Crowder indeed orchestrated the disappearances, he'd done it with such precision that it bordered on genius. A genius as dark and cold as the concrete alleys that carved through Chicago's underbelly. And while detectives scrambled to put together the pieces of the puzzle, Billy Crowder remained exactly where he wanted to be, untouchable yet right at the center of it all. The power struggle. The streets of Chicago, particularly its east side, have long been a bruised battleground for dominance. Crime, like capitalism, bred competition, and behind every illicit empire stood men willing to burn or bleed to rise higher than the rest. In the late 1980s, the lucrative underground gambling trade became the crown jewel of contention, and at the center of it all stood two titans, Nathan Kingston and an emerging force from the South Side indirectly tied to Billy Crowder's empire. It was a slow, simmering storm, the kind of power struggle that didn't explode overnight but spiraled into chaos as tempers, ambition, and egos spiraled out of control. For years, Nathan Kingston had operated as a kingpin in Chicago's gambling racket. His wealth poured in through hidden poker rooms, high-stakes dice games, and secret bets placed under flickering neon signs. Though Kingston profited from the affluent East Side, his operations extended westward as well, infiltrating working-class enclaves with subtlety and precision. However, his successes weren't purely business-driven, they came with an air of menace. Those who defied him quickly learned why he was nicknamed the Chess Master. He didn't swing bats or pull triggers himself, but his moves, strategically planned and ruthlessly executed, left opponents crippled or worse. Billy Crowder, on the other hand, despite his polished public persona as a hotel magnate, was no stranger to territorial maneuvering. Crowder's network, centered on smugglers, enforcers, and middlemen, made him a major power broker capable of deciding who thrived and who crumbled within the city's criminal framework. While Crowder often stayed out of direct disputes, his rising protégés began eyeing Kingston's East Side empire as ripe for the taking. Chief among these younger players was Crowder's ambitious cousin, Derek "Dagger" Myers, a sharp-witted provocateur known for his short temper and even shorter patience with rivals. The problem with Dagger wasn't that he wanted Kingston's territory, it was how he wanted to take it, fast, aggressive, and loud. Rumors swirled that Dagger had quietly started squeezing Kingston's outlying operators, poaching dealers and sharks by offering richer cuts and insurance if they flipped to Crowder's camp. At first, Kingston dismissed the moves as petty. Dagger wasn't even worth a chess match, not yet. But when one of his trusted crews was hit in a daytime ambush outside a warehouse near the riverfront, the game began to escalate. The ambush wasn't just a robbery, it was a power move. Kingston's men were transporting one of the biggest cash loads of the quarter, money owed from weeks of gambling debts. That haul vanished, along with 3 of his enforcers, their bodies found days later in a landfill with their hands zip-tied behind their backs and their throats cut. The message wasn't subtle. Nathan Kingston kept his cool publicly, but those closest to him could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. This wasn't just business, this was an insult, a challenge wrapped around a blatant attempt to destabilize his empire. And with whispered connections back to Billy Crowder and the Southside syndicates, Kingston's fury ignited into purpose. Across the divide, Dagger Myers basked in his small victories, though his arrogance blinded him to the larger consequences of his actions. While he claimed to be acting independently, many in Chicago suspected he had Crowder's blessing, or at least his indifference, to push against Kingston. To Dagger, loyalty meant little compared to profit and power. From the East Side's perspective, the ambush wasn't just Dagger's doing, it had Crowder's fingerprints all over it. Things boiled over one late September night when Kingston made what many considered his boldest move. One of Crowder's upscale business clubs was raided by a masked crew tied to Kingston's men. The raid wasn't about the money, it was personal. They left graffiti sprayed across the walls, "Stay out of the East." Carved into the oak bar was an unmistakable warning. The crown belonged to Kingston, and there'd be no splitting it in half. What happened next turned the power struggle into an irreparable grudge. Dagger Myers, in his fury and desperation, staged what he called the Declaration of War. On a Friday night, he and his men hit Kingston's half-legal gambling island located within an emptied supermarket on Chicago's far west side. In less than 20 minutes, the place was burned to cinders, causing hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, and leaving a Kingston lieutenant in the hospital with shattered kneecaps. Unknowingly, though, Dagger's recklessness had set off a chain reaction he wouldn't live long enough to regret. Crowder, ever calculated and eager to avoid spotlighted violence disrupting his brand's veneer of legitimacy, was privately furious at Dagger for dragging his name into the fire. To Crowder, the key to dominance wasn't petty attacks or some brash reckoning, it was control, leverage, and patience. Dagger, ignorant of how the city's political strings were pulled, had jeopardized it all by allowing his ego to dictate his decisions. Crowder reluctantly stepped in, signaling to his broader operations that the games Dagger played had run their course. For Nathan Kingston, however, this wasn't just about Dagger or Crowder. While Dagger's death, orchestrated through a suspicious carjacking gone wrong, sent a strong message, it hardly appeased Kingston. His Eastside operations were destabilized, forcing him to grapple with new challenges while knowing Crowder's quiet influence still loomed large. To make matters worse, word on the street seemed to hint that the Royal Lux Hotel itself had hosted several clandestine gatherings involving Derek Myers before his demise, a subtle nod that Crowder had allowed the flame that eventually burned Kingston's empire to be lit under his roof. The tension reached a tipping point when Kingston made a move that shocked even his closest allies. He contacted Billy Crowder directly. The message was short, an invitation for a private meeting to redefine the boundaries. Behind the cordial tone, however, lay the echo of Kingston's true intent. This wasn't an olive branch, it was the setup for the battle he had long been planning, one that would finally put to rest the question of who truly ran Chicago's streets. That meeting, held in the now infamous room 318 of the Royal Lux Hotel, wasn't just another mob negotiation. It was the culmination of years of grudges, betrayals, and calculated maneuvers. Neither Kingston nor Crowder would emerge unscarred. How far one man would go to defend his empire, and how far the other would push back, would define the kind of bloodshed Chicago hadn't seen in decades. Chicago's power struggle was no longer just about territory, it was about legacy, ego, and control. And when giants collide, the result is rarely clean. The complex assault. In the ruthless world of Chicago's underworld, escalation was more a daily ritual than an anomaly. Every hit had to be answered, every slight demanded retaliation. So when Derek "Dagger" Myers, cousin to Billy Crowder and one of his fiercest enforcers, was beaten to within an inch of his life by Nathan Kingston's men in what could only be described as a deliberate, brutal reminder, the balance of power tipped closer toward total chaos. For weeks, tension had been mounting between Kingston's East Side crew and the South Side faction tied to Crowder. Rumors whispered across dives and poker rooms. Kingston wasn't just sending a warning, he was testing the boundaries, pressing Crowder and his operation to see just how far they could be pushed. But what Kingston didn't anticipate was the uncoiled rage that would follow when the wrong man was singled out. Dagger Myers wasn't just another gangland enforcer. He had built his reputation with his fists long before aligning with Crowder's shadowy empire. What he lacked in subtlety, he made up for with sheer brutality and an almost pathological loyalty to Crowder. A man who repaid loyalty with power, Crowder had seen promise in his cousin's raw aggression and groomed him into a formidable figure in the South Side circles. So when Kingston's crew cornered him in a dingy alleyway behind a late-night bar and beat him senseless, it wasn't just personal. It was war. The assault wasn't random, it was calculated. Kingston's men knew exactly where Dagger would be that night, eating greasy ribs and downing whiskeys at Mickey Lou's, one of the South Side's favorite gangster haunts. As Dagger stumbled out the back entrance, high on liquor and puffed up ego, Kingston's top lieutenants were waiting. They moved fast, precise, a silent ambush. "Leave him breathing," one of Kingston's men allegedly ordered, his voice low but cold. "Just enough so he knows who's coming next." The work was thorough, surgical even. Dagger's legs were shattered with crowbars, one swing after another until the bones cracked like dry wood. His jaw was broken, his ribs bruised so badly that his breaths became wheezes. By the time the assault ended, Dagger Myers was left slumped in the filthy alley, blood pooling beneath him. Each of the attackers left a single-gloved handprint smeared in red on the brick wall behind him, a signature meant not just for Crowder but for the entire Southside crew. When Crowder heard the news, his simmering anger burned white-hot. Dagger was family, but more importantly, the assault was an affront to Crowder's command. It was clear Kingston wanted more than just a skirmish. He wanted to humiliate Crowder by targeting someone so close to his inner circle. "It's blood they want," Crowder reportedly said during a private meeting with his top lieutenants days later. "Then it's blood they're gonna get." What followed was no instinctive reaction, but a meticulously orchestrated act of vengeance, one fitting of Crowder's reputation as the calculating puppet master of Chicago's criminal web. He didn't just want to hit back. He wanted to send a message so clear, so haunting, that no one on the East Side would dare challenge his operation again. The plan was set in motion within hours. Crowder gave the reins to Danny "Ice" Travers, his go-to man for complex and high-stakes missions. Travers wasn't just ruthless, he was precise, earning his moniker for his methodical, cold-blooded temperament in the face of chaos. This time, though, Travers wasn't just leading some routine retaliation. Crowder tasked him with executing something that would cripple Kingston's operation without leaving Crowder's fingerprints on it. The target, one of Kingston's most fortified cash drop sites, a covert operation disguised as the storage wing of a failing seafood processing plant. Located on the fringes of the East Side, this facility was one of Kingston's financial lifelines, a hub for laundering vast sums of money pulled from his network of illegal gambling dens, drug runners, and bookies. The funds here didn't just flow through his empire, they fueled it. The assault began on a crisp, fog-heavy Chicago night. the kind of evening when streetlights seemed to flicker dimmer than usual. Travers and his men arrived in unmarked vans, blending into the industrial speck of the city's outskirts. The team consisted of hardened professionals, not your average gangbangers hungry for quick cash, but disciplined operatives handpicked from Crowder's personal roster. The first strike was a distraction. 3 men set off controlled explosions at the plant's eastern gate, a fireball that roared into the chilly night sky and drew immediate attention from the security detail posted around the facility. Kingston's guards, seasoned but overwhelmed, rushed toward the commotion, leaving the rear of the compound exposed. Travers and his squad made their move. Armed with silenced weapons and breaching tools, they stormed the building with chilling precision. Surveillance footage recovered weeks later, though grainy and incomplete after Crowder's tech crew accidentally wiped most of it, showed Travers leading the charge. Room by room, Kingston's men were subdued, some shot cleanly between the eyes, others taken down with brutal efficiency. The team wasn't there to steal cash outright. Crowder had ordered something more devastating: burn it. By the time the assault was over, Kingston's cash reserves were reduced to charred ash, the processing wing of the facility left smoldering from within. As a final touch, Travers left behind a single symbolic calling card, a crowbar planted upright in the middle of the factory floor, its handle wrapped in bloodied burlap, a not-so-subtle nod to Dagger Meyer's assault. But the real genius of Crowder's response? His complete deniability. Officially, Crowder was hosting investors that same night at a charity cocktail event in his flagship downtown nightclub. Photographs plastered across tabloids showed him smiling with Chicago's elite, toasting champagne glasses and shaking hands, his gleaming persona masking the carnage he had just unleashed. Kingston's empire reeled. The loss wasn't just financial, it was psychological. His most trusted men scrambled to regroup, rumors racing like wildfire that Crowder's Southside crew was behind the heist. Still, there was no evidence, no clear connection, no weak threads through which Kingston could pull Crowder to the forefront. For Crowder, that was the beauty of the assault. Its complexity lay in its simplicity. To outsiders, it appeared like a rogue third party had capitalized on Kingston's mounting vulnerabilities. Behind the scenes, Crowder knew better. He had made his move, intricate yet brutal, and left his rival with a choice: retreat or retaliate. Kingston, however, wasn't one to bow down, not after such a direct and humiliating attack. All the crowbars, burned cash, and merciless assaults in the world wouldn't convince him to step aside. If Crowder thought fear had won the night, he was about to discover what happens when a man like Nathan Kingston decides the only solution is absolute retribution. The vicious kidnapping plot. There's an unwritten rule in the underworld: families stay out of the line of fire. Businesses may be torched, alliances may falter, and bullets may fly, but the kids, the spouses, they're supposed to remain untouchable. But rules carry little weight when desperation enters the picture, and for Billy Crowder's crew, there was no greater demonstration of raw power than targeting what mattered most to their enemy. That's exactly why they went after Amy Kingston, the youngest and only child of Nathan and Marie Kingston. Amy was just 14 years old at the time, an innocent trapped in a world her parents had been careful to shield her from. She was smart but soft-spoken, her honey-colored hair often tied back with simple ribbons. Her days were spent attending an exclusive private school in downtown Chicago, a haven for the city's elite families. Afternoons were for piano lessons, volunteer events her mother arranged, and the occasional shopping trip in Lincoln Park with friends. Amy Kingston was the very picture of privilege and naivete, until the night that privilege was ripped away in one precise, bone-chilling move. The kidnapping was planned with meticulous care, orchestrated not by Billy Crowder himself but by one of his most trusted enforcers, Danny "Ice" Travers. Travers got his nickname not because he was particularly cool under pressure, though he certainly was, but because the aftermath of his violent work often left people frozen in fear. If Crowder was known for playing the long game, Travers excelled at executing the moments that made people scream. The plot unfolded on an otherwise ordinary Thursday night. Nathan Kingston had been unusually preoccupied that week, dealing with mounting tensions over his East Side operations. Marie Kingston, as elegant and poised as ever, was planning a grand event for the weekend, a high-profile charity gala meant to cement the couple's reputation among Chicago's upper crust. Amy, meanwhile, attended her evening ballet practice, a routine part of her structured teenage life. Unbeknownst to her, the black SUV parked just down the street from the dance studio was no accident. The SUV had been there all day, its occupants blending into the urban hum of the city. Inside sat Travers, along with two hired guns known only by their street nicknames, Crawler and Big Pete. They had watched Amy step out of a chauffeured car, kiss her mother goodbye, and disappear into the studio's glass doors. They had watched the lights flicker as the dancers practiced their plies and pirouettes. They'd waited, patient, silent, as each parent came to pick up their child one by one. Finally, at 9:17 p.m., Amy emerged through the studio's front door. She was bundled in a wool coat against the crisp fall air, chatting with a friend as they parted ways and headed toward their respective rides. The Kingston family chauffeur, held up by unexpected traffic, wasn't there to meet her fast enough. That gap, the one unguarded moment, was all Travers needed. They grabbed her without hesitation. One man covered her mouth to muffle her screams, while another threw a thick black hood over her head and wrestled her into the back seat. It was surgical, lasting no more than 12 seconds. By the time the chauffeur arrived, Amy and her captors had already melted into the congested Chicago streets, leaving behind nothing but her ballet bag and one scuffed left shoe lying on the sidewalk. The Kingstons didn't know their daughter was missing until after 10 p.m., when the panicked chauffeur called home, stammering about how he couldn't find her. As the minutes ticked by, Marie's calm exterior began to crack, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into her palms as she tried to rationalize what could have happened. Nathan, on the other hand, erupted into a controlled fury. The call hadn't come yet, the call he knew was inevitable. Someone would take credit for Amy's disappearance, and that someone would demand something impossible in return. The call came just after midnight. Nathan's personal phone buzzed, the number unlisted, the voice distorted. "We've got your girl," the caller said, the casual malice in their tone grinding like broken glass. "You step out of line once, she doesn't step back into your life. Keep your men out of Southside business for good. Got it? We'll be in touch." Then the line went dead. Amy, meanwhile, sat trembling in the corner of a dusty, dimly lit basement somewhere south of the city. The black hood had been removed, but her wrists remained bound with zip ties and her mouth gagged with a strip of duct tape. She'd been told little, other than to stay quiet if she didn't want things to get worse. The men guarding her alternated their attention between her frightened figure and the poker game sprawled across a rickety card table nearby. Every so often, one of them would glance over, their cold eyes piercing her shaken frame like daggers. Unlike most kids her age, Amy didn't scream or beg. She just cried softly, her tears soaking into the collar of her coat. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was her parents' unspoken strength buried somewhere deep inside. Whatever it was, it kept her alive long enough for a break in Crowder's chain of command. A mistake that ultimately led to her rescue. 4 days into the ordeal, Travers sent a photo of Amy to Nathan's phone, a chilling image of her sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor, duct tape still across her small, hollowed face. But Travers made a rookie oversight. The shadow of a distinctive steel column in the background accidentally revealed the location as a known storage facility in Little Village. Nathan, using every connection he had, pinpointed the warehouse faster than the police could mobilize. What came next was nothing short of an explosive operation. Nathan's men didn't wait for official backup. They moved in with quiet precision, taking Travers and his goons by surprise. Amy was found huddled in the corner of the room she'd been confined in, her face pale but otherwise unharmed. Her rescue sparked a sudden eruption of violence in Chicago's criminal underworld, a tit-for-tat bloodbath as Nathan Kingston unleashed his vengeance against anyone remotely associated with the kidnapping. For Amy, life would never be the same. She returned home safe but fundamentally changed, her once bright eyes clouded with trauma she couldn't put into words. For Nathan, the kidnapping wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war, one that would be etched into Chicago's bloody history for years to come. The pain and the resolve for revenge. Amy Kingston's rescue was meant to be a moment of relief, a triumphant ending to a parent's worst nightmare, but it was anything but. The damage had already been done, the wounds carved not just into her young, irreproachable mind, but into the psyche of her entire family. For Nathan Kingston, the man who spent his life controlling outcomes, predicting threats, and maneuvering enemies, it was a searing moment of failure. A failure that, in his world, could only be answered with blood. Amy returned home a ghost of herself, the once gentle, inquisitive girl who filled the Kingston mansion with the lilting sounds of her piano, now tiptoed through life as if every shadow bore fangs. She slept curled up in a corner of her vast bedroom, unable to find peace even in her own bed. Her bright hazel eyes, once wide with a teenager's naive curiosity, were now dull with the weight of something no child should have ever borne. Her laughter was gone, her silences deafening. And for Nathan, watching his daughter withdraw from the life he had worked so hard to insulate her from, was unbearable. His wife Marie, strong, elegant, and ever composed, spent hours at Amy's bedside, brushing her daughter's hair in a gesture as much to calm herself as the girl who trembled beneath her touch. Nathan, on the other hand, spent those same hours pacing his office like a caged lion with a storm building behind his eyes. Staring down at the Chicago skyline from his penthouse window, he didn't just agonize over what had been done, he was calculating his next steps. The image of Amy bound and gagged in that photo Travers had sent haunted him. The cold, hollow concrete of that basement became a picture seared into his mind. It wasn't just anger, it was shame. Nathan Kingston, the chess master, the man who was always 7 moves ahead, had allowed someone to violate the sanctity of his family. That was unforgivable, not just for his enemies, but for himself. "They came after my blood," Nathan said one night, his voice like gravel grinding beneath a heavy boot. He was speaking to Marie, but it was as though he were speaking to the entire universe. No one will ever do that again." Marie met his eyes from across the room. She was no stranger to Nathan's resolve, having watched him navigate years of bloody negotiations and rivalries to build his empire. But this was different. This wasn't about money, power, or territory. This was personal, and for Nathan, personal meant the rules were about to change. "Do what you have to do," she finally said, her voice steady but her grip on the arm of her chair betraying her true emotions. "Make them pay." That was all Nathan needed. If Crowder's crew thought they had delivered a message by abducting his daughter, they had underestimated the depths of his fury. Nathan wasn't going to send a message in return. He was going to carve a monument to vengeance that would stand as a warning to anyone who dared cross him again. The first thing Nathan did was assemble his inner circle, a group of loyalists who had been with him since the early days of his empire. These were men who owed him everything, and feared him even more than they respected him. His second-in-command, Marco Iron Leone, a towering figure with a reputation for ruthlessness, stared at Nathan across the polished oak table in the dim, smoke-filled room of Kingston's private nightclub. "What's the play, boss?" Marco asked, his voice gruff, his fingers brushing the edge of his unlit cigar. Nathan's gaze burned. "We're not just hitting them," he began, his tone low but cutting. "We're dismantling them, piece by piece. Crowder, Travers, anyone who breathed the same air as those bastards that touched Amy. I want them to choke on their mistakes. We're going to make this city uninhabitable for them." Marco nodded. "And what about Crowder himself? You think he'll come out from his castle to play?" Nathan leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "He will, because by the time we're done, he won't have anywhere else to run." The campaign of vengeance began subtly. Nathan didn't just go for the obvious targets, he wanted to rip Crowder's operation apart at the seams. It started with the small, almost invisible threads that held the South Side Empire together. Ports used for drug drops were sabotaged, cargo mysteriously vanished mid-transport, key lieutenants in Crowder's network began showing up dead in alleys, their disfigurements a grisly reminder of what they had done to Dagger Myers at Kingston's hands weeks earlier. But Nathan didn't stop there. He wanted Crowder to feel the same vulnerability he had felt when Amy was taken, so he went after not just his business, but his people. Crowder's best chemist, the man responsible for cooking up thousands of dollars worth of premium crack every week, was found dangling by his ankles from a freeway overpass. His youngest operative, a wiry 19-year-old who ran messages between Crowder's lieutenants, disappeared one day, only to reappear stuffed into a duffel bag on the steps of one of Crowder's clubs. The attacks were relentless, calculated, and terrifying. Crowder's reaction was predictable. The man, ever the chess master himself in the shadows of Chicago, tried to maintain control. He reinforced his inner circle, doubled payouts to loyalists, and even whispered bribes into the ears of cops who lingered too close to his operations. But Nathan was 2 steps ahead. The chaos choked Crowder's organization from within, forcing his men to fracture as they fought not just Kingston but each other. And yet, this wasn't enough for Nathan. Collapsing Crowder's business was one thing, but the man himself? That was a different matter. Nathan Kingston wanted to look Billy Crowder in the eyes when the final piece of this bloody puzzle fell into place, which is why the next step in his grand revenge plan involved the Royal Lux itself. Nathan's anger simmered, held at bay by his cunning mind. He understood Crowder was most dangerous when cornered. For someone like Billy Crowder, survival meant adaptation, and Nathan needed to ensure there was no adapting this time. His final play would be brutal, theatrical even, something that would echo through Chicago's streets for decades. But for that, Nathan needed a stage. And what better stage than the gilded halls of Crowder's own fortress? The vengeance wasn't just about Crowder anymore. It was about sending a message to the entire city, stamped in blood. Nathan Kingston was untouchable. And the cost of trying? Unimaginable. Reconciliation or revenge? Nathan Kingston was not a man to forgive and certainly not a man to forget, but he was a man of strategy, and in his world strategy was more important than emotion. On the surface, his invitation to Billy Crowder for a private meeting at the Royal Lux Hotel seemed like a measured, even diplomatic decision. Nathan couched the message in the language of reconciliation, offering Crowder a rare opportunity to redefine boundaries and prevent further bloodshed. For the untrained eye, this might have seemed like a turning point, an olive branch extended in good faith, but no one who truly understood Nathan believed the lie, not Crowder, not even Nathan's own men, because this wasn't a truce. This wasn't a negotiation to mend fences or balance the scales. This was a setup, plain and simple. A meticulously crafted trap designed to end one of Chicago's most infamous rivalries in bloodshed, once and for all. Room 318, one of the finest suites at the Royal Lux, was chosen as the location for their meeting, immaculately furnished with lush velvet curtains, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown, and a dining table set for kings. The room was a symbol of luxury. It was as if Crowder's empire itself had been personified in this room, opulent, crafted with care but cloaked in shadows. That was, of course, intentional. Nathan wanted Crowder to feel at home, comforted, safe. But beneath the gilded surface of hospitality was Nathan's true plan, a choreography of destruction designed to strike quickly and decisively. He didn't just want Crowder dead, he wanted everything Crowder stood for to crumble with him. For his part, Crowder wasn't naive. He understood the rules of the game, and the timing of Nathan's invitation was not lost on him. Nathan Kingston, whose ferocity and cunning had only grown sharper since Amy's kidnapping, had gone quiet for weeks after the rescue. Too quiet. And any seasoned player in Chicago's criminal underworld knew that silence was usually the precursor to a storm. Even Crowder's most trusted lieutenants advised against accepting the invitation. "It's a trap, boss," Danny Travers warned, despite still nursing bruises from Nathan's retaliatory strikes. "The man's too angry to negotiate. You'll walk in there, but you might not even walk out." But Crowder waved off their concerns with a calculated grin. "Nathan wants a show? Fine, let's give him one," he said smoothly, his tone laced with both amusement and danger. After all, Crowder wasn't one to run from conflict. If Nathan wanted a stage, Crowder was prepared to master the performance. The night of the meeting arrived, and the air in Chicago felt heavy, almost electric. The mood inside the Royal Lux wasn't much different. Staff had been instructed to clear the third floor of all guests for routine maintenance, but this was no coincidence. It was Nathan ensuring there would be no witnesses. Nathan Kingston showed up first, dressed in a sharp three-piece suit that exuded confidence. He wasn't alone. Hidden across the hotel were a dozen of his most loyal men, armed to the teeth and ready for the signal, a simple knock on the coffee table in room 318, to spring into lethal action. But for Nathan, this had to look like peace, at least at first. His demeanor was calm, even charismatic, as he paced the suite, sipping whiskey and waiting for the game to begin. Billy Crowder arrived precisely on time, his own men shadowing him at a distance. Ever the opportunist, he entered the suite with his signature smirk, his tailored suit whispering of wealth and control. He scanned the room with a practiced eye, his instincts sharp as a blade. He noticed the opulence, of course, but he also noticed the small details, the chairs that had been strategically arranged, the way Nathan had positioned himself near the windows, the faint sound of movement from the hallway outside. "Nathan," Crowder said, his tone dripping with irony as he extended his hand, "you've outdone yourself. It's not every day I get invited to such generous accommodations." Nathan accepted the handshake but held Crowder's gaze for a moment too long. "Only the best for old friends," he replied smoothly, his grip firm. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that thickened with every breath. Both men took their seats at the table, a bottle of aged bourbon between them. Each poured a glass but neither drank. "So," Crowder began, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had lived through and orchestrated his fair share of betrayals. "Here we are. You called me, Nathan. Let's hear it. What's so important that you'd want to drag me out of my empire for a little chat? Nathan's smile was thin, almost predatory. I think you and I both know we can't bleed this city dry forever. Too many bodies piling up, too many eyes starting to look in places they shouldn't. If we keep crossing lines, there won't be anything left for either of us. Crowder raised an eyebrow, his amusement barely concealed. A logical argument, he said, gesturing with his glass. But you're not calling for logic. You're calling for revenge. Nathan allowed the room to fall silent, letting Crowder's words hang in the air. Then with deliberate calm he placed his glass down on the table. You're right, Nathan admitted, his voice low and cutting. This isn't about saving the city, it's about saving what's mine, and you took something from me I can't forgive. The subtle knock on the wooden coffee table echoed through the room like a gunshot. Almost instantly, chaos descended. Hidden doors swung open, and Kingston's men burst into the room, weapons drawn. Crowder's instincts took hold as he dove behind the dining table, pulling his pistol from inside his jacket. Shots rang out, shattering glass and tearing through the luxury furnishings as the suite became a deadly battlefield. Crowder's own men, stationed in the hallway, rushed to respond as gunmen stationed by Kingston intercepted them. The Royal Lux's marbled hallways, pristine only minutes earlier, erupted into carnage as bullets flew and bodies fell. Inside room 318, Nathan and Crowder were locked in a lethal dance of survival. Crowder, fueled by his survivalist instincts, flipped the dining table to use as cover. Nathan, however, was calm, firing with precision as he slowly advanced, his face a mask of grim determination. By the time the dust settled, room 318 was a blood-soaked monument to destruction. Crowder lay wounded but alive in the shattered remnants of what once was his fortress. Nathan stood over him, his gun aimed steadily at Crowder's chest. "You should have stayed in your empire, Billy," Nathan said coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. "But you stepped into mine." The truth of what happened at the Royal Lux would soon spread like wildfire through Chicago's streets. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't even a negotiation. It was the culmination of years of hatred, betrayal, and bloodlust, executed in the only way men like Kingston and Crowder knew, with devastating violence. This wasn't just the end of a rivalry. This was the beginning of a legend, one that Chicago would never forget. The Massacre in the Shadows. The calm after the carnage in room 318 at the Royal Lux Hotel was deceptive, like the shallow breath of a wounded predator waiting for its chance to strike. Outside the marbled walls of Chicago's most infamous hotel, the city buzzed on, oblivious to the war that had just ignited. The massacre that followed wasn't just another street brawl or mob retaliation, it was calculated chaos, a symphony of destruction composed by Nathan Kingston and his men, played out under the cover of night. It began only hours after the so-called peace meeting ended in bloodshed. Nathan wasn't a man to let the dust settle. His strategy demanded momentum. He knew that if Billy Crowder's South Side Syndicate had any chance to regroup, they'd counterstrike with the full force of their fury. Nathan couldn't afford that. He had to dismantle Crowder's operation before it could breathe again, and he had to do it ruthlessly, leaving no room for doubt about who held the reins of power in Chicago. Midnight Directive. In the aftermath of room 318, Nathan gathered his most trusted inner circle in a dimly lit warehouse tucked away on the east side docks. The room smelled of sawdust and salt water, the faint hum of shipping crates being loaded outside blending with the tension in the air. Marco Iron Leone, Nathan's second-in-command, leaned against a steel column, his knuckles still bruised from the night's earlier violence. Around him, a dozen of Nathan's most loyal enforcers, men with names whispered more like warnings in Chicago's underworld, waited for their orders. "We don't wait for them to come to us," Nathan began, pacing the room like a general surveying his battlefield. "Crowder's men are licking their wounds right now trying to figure out what just hit them. If we give them even a second to organize, it'll be like room 318 never happened. We strike tonight, and I mean everywhere." "How hard we hitting them?" Marco asked, lighting a cigar, his voice a low growl. Nathan stopped pacing and turned to face the group, his eyes burned with a fury that felt almost inhuman. "Hard enough that not one of them walks out of this city alive. You find them in their homes, their hideouts, their little corner bars. Hell, you pull them out of their beds if you have to." There was a brief silence as Nathan's words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. Then Marco nodded, his lips curving into a cruel smile. "I like it. Let's remind them why they fear us." The city descends into darkness. The first strike came at a Southside gambling den hidden beneath an old butcher shop. The place was a fortress of activity most nights, bustling with smoke-filled poker games and illegal craps tables. But tonight, it was eerily quiet, as if the city itself had started to sense something brewing. Nathan's men, dressed in black and armed with suppressed weapons, breached the building with military-like precision. The few guards stationed at the entrance never had a chance to react. By the time the gamblers inside realized what was happening, it was too late. Tables were overturned, cash scattered across the blood-stained tiles as Kingston's crew tore through the den like a hurricane. Men who pledged loyalty to Crowder were lined up and executed one by one, their bodies left sprawled across the room as a grim warning. Marco himself carved the word King into the wall above the bodies using the blade of his hunting knife. Not an hour later, another crew hit one of Crowder's largest stash houses, a nondescript warehouse used to store everything from cocaine bricks to counterfeit cash. The assault was even more violent than the first. Explosives planted around the building lit up the Chicago night sky, the fire consuming not just the drugs, but Crowder's profits. The thick black smoke that billowed from the structure carried a message. Nathan Kingston wasn't here to play games anymore. The attacks were relentless. In less than 6 hours, Kingston's men had hit 7 locations across the South Side. Each target was met with the same brutal efficiency. No survivors, no mercy. A bar frequented by Crowder's enforcers was burned to the ground, the smell of charred wood and spilled whiskey lingering long after the flames were extinguished. A shipping yard, known to be one of Crowder's key smuggling routes, was completely gutted, the cargo stripped, and the dock workers left beaten and bloodied. The human cost. For Crowder's crew, the massacre wasn't just a loss, it was annihilation. By the time word reached Billy himself, he was holed up in one of his safe houses on the far edge of the South Side. The tension in the room was suffocating as Travers, his most trusted enforcer, delivered the news. "Kingston's ripping us apart," Travers said, his voice tight with frustration. "He's not just taking our spots, he's taking us out." Billy paced back and forth, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. "Where's Marco? Where's Kingston himself? He hiding behind his men like a coward?" Travers shook his head. "Marco's leading most of the hits, but Kingston's calling the shots from the east side. He's not hiding, Billy, he's pulling strings, and he's doing it damn well." Billy slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing through the safe house. For the first time in years, the king of the South Side felt cornered, his empire crumbling faster than he could rebuild it. The night ends in blood. By the time the sun began to rise over Chicago, the city's underworld had been permanently scarred. The South Side was littered with bodies, the stench of death hanging heavy in the air. The carnage left behind wasn't just a display of power, it was a declaration of total dominance. Nathan Kingston stood on the rooftop of one of his East Side properties, staring out over the city as the morning light crept across the skyline. The sounds of the night's destruction still echoed in his ears, gunfire, screams, and the distant wail of sirens. But Nathan felt no remorse, no hesitation in what he had done. This was the price of betrayal, the cost of messing with his family. Behind him, Marco approached, his shirt speckled with blood, a satisfied but weary grin on his face. "It's done," Marco said simply. Nathan didn't turn to face him. "No," he replied, his voice calm but cold. "It's not done until Crowder's body is lying at my feet." Marco nodded, his grin widening. "Then we'll find him." Nathan finally turned, his eyes like steel. "Find him, Marco, and when you do, I want to be the one to pull the trigger." The ripple effect. In the days that followed, rumors of the massacre swept through Chicago, carried on whispers and back-alley murmurings. The city's criminals spoke of Nathan Kingston with a mix of fear and awe, his name now synonymous with merciless efficiency. Billy Crowder, meanwhile, disappeared from public view, his once mighty empire reduced to ashes. But Nathan wasn't finished. The massacre in the shadows was only the prelude to what he had planned next. For Nathan, this wasn't just about winning a war, it was about rewriting Chicago's history, with his name etched in blood as the unchallenged ruler of its criminal empire. The Fugitive Journey. Nathan Kingston wasn't the kind of man who got caught, or at least, that's what people believed. Over the years, his cunning and capability to outmaneuver rivals, law enforcement, and even his own allies at times, had built him an aura of invincibility. But power corrupts, and the collateral damage of his recent rampage through Chicago had made him both untouchable in the criminal underworld and a glaring target for the authorities. By the time the dust settled on the massacre in the South Side, Nathan had already gone dark, vanishing like a shadow slipping through the cracks in the city's concrete jungle. For Chicago's law enforcement, Nathan was no longer just a kingpin controlling illegal gambling, extortion, and smuggling. He was public enemy number one. Every detective in the organized crime unit had his name on their lips, and federal agencies, stirred into action by the explosion of violence across the city, swarmed in to investigate. He had become a ghost, but ghosts leave traces. It became a manhunt of unprecedented proportions, one fueled not just by the need for justice but by the story the headlines had created. The chessmaster kingpin on the run. Slipping into the shadows, Nathan Kingston's journey into hiding was neither accidental nor impulsive. The moment the first gunshot rang out in room 318 of the Royal Lux Hotel, Nathan knew what would follow. He had always been a man of strategy, and he didn't just plan wars, he planned for the aftermath. Minutes after the final shots in the hotel, Nathan left the Royal Lux through its underground service corridors. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, his trademark suit stashed somewhere in the chaos, he blended into the night like any other shadowed figure slipping into Chicago's labyrinth of alleys. Marco Iron Leone, his most trusted lieutenant, had already arranged a series of safe houses scattered across the city, each location designed for one purpose: temporary refuge before moving on. His first stop was a modest apartment buried in the heart of Bucktown, the kind of place where the neighbors didn't ask questions, where the blaring of televisions and the cries of street vendors masked the kind of secrets the building inevitably held. Behind the locked door of apartment 4B, Nathan stripped off the last remnants of his identity, his watch, his shoes, even his phone, which he dunked into a pot of acid Marco had left behind, ready for disposal. He stayed there just long enough to wash the blood off his hands, both figuratively and literally, before the next leg of his journey. "You're clear for now," Marco told him during a brief hushed phone call on a burner. "The cops are hitting up your properties, but they don't have a clue about the safe houses. They're looking in all the wrong places." "Good," Nathan replied, his tone sharp but calm. "I won't be in any of the right places." The weight of shadows. For a man like Nathan, vanishing wasn't just a logistical task. It was an emotional one. The life he had built for decades, the empire he had fought for, was crumbling behind him. His daughter Amy, still recovering from the trauma of her abduction, was safe, but separated from him. Marie, his ever-loyal wife, had been instructed to remain in the mansion under heavy guard, facing the scrutiny of the authorities and headlines branding their family as the epicenter of Chicago's chaos. Nathan thought about Amy constantly as he bounced from one safe house to the next. A dingy warehouse loft on the South Side, a one-room cabin on the outskirts of Indiana, even the back of an abandoned cannery where the stench of rotting fish kept anyone from wandering too close. A battle raged within him. Amy was the reason he had done all this, but she was also what kept him tethered to a life that now felt distant, nearly unreachable. "It's not forever," he told himself as he stared at the cracked mirror of a safe-house bathroom, his face gaunt and eyes hollowed with sleepless nights. "Just until it's done." The chase tightens, but Nathan wasn't invisible. As smart as he was, no one could stay hidden forever, not when the entire city and half the FBI were hot on their trail. While Marco and the remnants of his crew worked meticulously to cover Nathan's tracks, dismantling credit cards, erasing records, and bribing key players to keep quiet, an almost supernatural determination began building on the other side of the law. Leading the hunt was Detective Lucas Grayson, a seasoned investigator with an obsession for precision that rivaled Nathan's own. Grayson wasn't fooled by the chaos Nathan had sowed to obscure his trail. He knew Kingston too well, had studied the man's criminal fingerprints for years, and understood that for all his cunning, Nathan always left breadcrumbs for those sharp enough to find them. When Nathan switched to a hideout on the rural outskirts of Galesburg, Illinois, a small farmhouse Marco's people had secured years earlier, it was Grayson's intuition that tipped him off. "He's not in the city anymore," Grayson had told his team after flipping through yet another stack of reports. "The man didn't just disappear, he moved. He's circling us, buying himself time. He'll resurface, but on his terms." What Grayson didn't expect, though, was how far Nathan was willing to go to keep his freedom. Crossing state lines. Nathan knew the Midwest was getting too hot. The cops were tightening their net, sniffing out safe houses, flipping minor members of his organization, and pushing closer to him with each passing day. He needed to vanish on a larger scale, to move so far outside their perimeter that even Grayson couldn't follow the scent. Through one of Marco's most elusive contacts, Nathan secured passage to Texas, a route involving fake IDs, cargo trucks, and the kind of shadowy network that operated without asking questions. For days, Nathan rode in the back of a freight truck, concealed among crates of produce bound for Houston. With nothing but his thoughts to keep him company in the darkness, he replayed every decision, every betrayal, and every act of violence that had led him here. When the truck finally slowed to a halt outside a scrapyard just outside San Antonio, Nathan stepped into the Texas sun a changed man. His beard had grown out, his once commanding posture slouched under the weight of weeks on the run. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. The final mistake. Nathan had planned everything, but no plan was perfect. Weeks after he had settled into a modest trailer on the outskirts of a dusty Texas town, he made a phone call, a brief, fleeting moment of weakness. His burner phone buzzed as he dialed Marie. "How is she?" he asked, skipping pleasantries. "She's doing better," Marie replied, her voice cracked. "But she misses you, Nate. Every day." "I miss her too," Nathan admitted. His tone softened, the weight of his love for Amy piercing through the layers of his hardened exterior. "Tell her I—" He didn't finish the sentence, his instincts catching on. He was being tracked. By the time he hung up, Grayson's team had already triangulated the signal to the Texas town. The wolves were closing in. The following morning, sirens blared in the distance as SWAT vans circled the town. Nathan, ever the strategist, made one final attempt to slip away, disappearing into the dense brush behind the trailer park. But even the sharpest predators aren't invincible. The standoff that followed was quiet but intense. Surrounded and out of options, Nathan finally raised his hands and surrendered, his face unreadable as Grayson stepped forward to make the arrest. "Hell of a run," Grayson muttered, cuffing the man who had haunted Chicago's underworld for decades. "Still not over," Nathan replied coolly, his voice carrying the defiance of a man who, even in chains, was never truly conquered. Legacy of Shadows. Nathan's capture marked the end of an era, but not the end of his story. For those who had crossed paths with the chessmaster, his fall was a reminder of how power, no matter how well defended, eventually collapses under its own weight. His fugitive journey of calculated risk and dogged survival would go down as one of Chicago's most infamous criminal sagas, a testament to the lengths a man will go to protect what he loves, and the price he'll pay to escape the shadows of his own making. The clue from a phone call. In the end, it wasn't a trail of forged documents, an informant's betrayal, or even meticulous detective legwork that led law enforcement to Nathan Kingston. It was something far more human, his love for his daughter. For months, Nathan had evaded capture. Every lead, every hunch from Detective Lucas Grayson and his organized crime unit had unraveled into dead ends. They tracked his associates, raided his properties, and even leaned on low-level members of Kingston's sprawling organization, flipping some with threats and others with cash. But Nathan? He was always 2 moves ahead, disappearing just as they thought they had a bead on him. Grayson, a man known for his relentless determination, struggled to suppress his frustration. "The guy's a damn ghost," he muttered during yet another strategy meeting, surrounded by scattered case files and a map of Chicago punctuated by colored pins marking Kingston's last known locations. "He's slipping further away, sir," one of his subordinates remarked, his voice tinged with defeat. But Grayson shook his head. "No, he hasn't left us entirely. A guy like Kingston, he doesn't walk away from the things he cares about. He's a runner, yeah, but he's still tethered. We just haven't tugged the right string yet." A father's weakness. Nathan Kingston had always been known for his meticulous planning, his ability to outthink everyone around him. But beneath the cold, calculating exterior was a man who had fiercely insulated himself from weakness, until his daughter Amy's kidnapping shattered the walls he'd built. Nathan's every thought was for her safety, her well-being. No matter how far he ran, Amy's image was the one thing he couldn't leave behind. He hadn't seen her in months, only hearing snippets about her recovery through carefully guarded conversations with Marco Leone, his trusted right-hand man. Marco was a buffer between Nathan and the world, a man who acted as his eyes and ears when it was too dangerous for Nathan to reach out himself. But Marco's updates weren't enough. Nathan needed to hear Marie's voice, needed to know that Amy, despite her trauma, was okay. And it was that need, raw, human, insistent, that pushed Nathan to take a risk he'd never allowed himself before. The call. The trailer Nathan was hiding in was simple, almost entirely barren, save for a flimsy desk, a sagging cot, and a patched leather chair that had seen better days. Outside, the dry Texas air buzzed with the distant hum of vehicles passing along the nearby highway. Nathan sat in the chair, his head bowed over the prepaid burner phone in his hands. His fingers hovered over the buttons, hesitating. He'd memorized Marie's number long ago. It was branded into his brain, a constant reminder of the life he'd left spinning in chaos back in Chicago. He promised her, that he wouldn't call, not until it was safe, not until he'd finished what he'd started and crushed Crowder's empire under his heel. But God, he missed her. And he missed Amy. Finally, he pressed the call button. It rang twice before Marie picked up. There was static on the line, but her voice broke through, caught somewhere between sharp tension and deep emotion. "Hello?" Nathan swallowed hard before speaking, his voice low, cautious. "It's me." There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a sharp intake of breath. "Nathan, where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm fine," he said quickly, his words clipped. "This isn't about me, it's about Amy. How is she?" Marie's voice softened instantly. "She's doing better. Little by little. She sleeps more now and she's starting to smile again, but only sometimes." Nathan closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. He'd give anything to see that smile in person, but instead he asked, "Is she scared?" There was a pause on the other end. "Not of us," Marie whispered. "But she carries it, Nate, the fear. She carries it everywhere she goes." Nathan didn't respond at first. His silence carried the weight of guilt, his breath heavy in the otherwise quiet trailer. Finally he said, "Tell her I love her every day. Tell her I'm not done yet. Tell her, I'll fix this." "Nate," Marie began, her voice faltering, "you can't fix everything." "Don't," he cut her off, his tone sharp. "I'm the reason this happened. I'll fix it, one way or another." Marie started to reply, but Nathan's survival instincts suddenly kicked in. Something wasn't right. He could feel it. A tightening in his gut. He spoke quickly, cutting Marie off again. "I have to go." And just like that, the connection was severed. The breadcrumb Nathan Kingston had built an empire on staying unseen, unheard. Slipping through cracks was his forte, and for months he'd been flawless. But that call, those fleeting moments of connection with Marie, was his fatal misstep. On the other side of the country, Detective Lucas Grayson was hunched over his desk, staring at the same computer screen for hours, as a junior officer approached. "Sir, we've got something." Grayson's head snapped up. "Spit it out!" "We traced a signal ping outside of Chicago," the officer began. "A call to Kingston's wife. It was short but long enough for a trace. We think it originated somewhere in Texas. Here, this is the approximate radius." He pointed to a crude map lit up on the monitor. Grayson leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Texas?" he muttered under his breath. "Our boy's gone south." "Should we alert the Bureau?" the officer asked. "No," Grayson replied sharply. "Not yet. If we blow this chance, we might lose him for good. Let's keep this quiet, for now." The wolves close. Back in Texas, Nathan had already gone on high alert. He knew calling Marie was reckless, but he couldn't resist. As night fell, he packed his minimal belongings into a duffel bag, his eyes scanning the horizon outside the trailer. The dry air felt heavier somehow, as though something was watching him. In the distance, sirens wailed, not loud enough to reach him, but enough to stir his instincts. The next morning, the trap was sprung. A caravan of unmarked vehicles crept into the nearby highway, agents armed and ready as tactical teams established a wide perimeter around the town. Nathan, ever a strategist, spotted the movements before they reached him. He fled into the dense brush behind the trailer park, his boots crunching dry earth as he pushed forward with every ounce of strength he had. But the wolves were too close. The standoff. For hours, they chased him under the relentless Texas sun. Nathan dodged, evaded, and doubled back, but exhaustion was setting in. Finally, surrounded and with nowhere left to run, Kingston stopped. His hands rose slowly, the burning heat of his breath matching the fire in his eyes as officers swarmed in. Detective Grayson approached, his gun drawn, his expression taut. "Nathan Kingston!" he called out, his voice sharp but steady. "You're done!" Nathan turned slowly, his movements deliberate. Despite everything, despite the sweat on his brow and the dust on his clothes, he still carried the air of a man undefeated. "Am I?" he replied, his voice calm. "You still had to hunt me, didn't you?" Grayson didn't flinch. He stepped forward, slapping the handcuffs around Nathan's wrists. "Hell of a run," he muttered, though there was a trace of respect in his voice. "You've hunted me," Nathan said quietly, his tone like gravel, "but you'll never bury me." The cost of a call. Nathan Kingston's capture marked the end of his fugitive journey, but the phone call that led to his downfall would be remembered as the moment his humanity outweighed his strategy. For all his cunning and calculated moves, it was his love for his family that unraveled him, a small flaw in the armor of a man who was otherwise impervious. and as headlines screamed, "The Chessmaster Captured" across every newspaper in America, Nathan wasn't thinking about his empire, his enemies, or even his freedom. He was thinking of Amy, and whether she'd ever truly be able to escape the shadows of the life he had built for them. The truth and the price to pay. As the courthouse doors swung open, the world outside erupted in flashes of camera lights and the shouts of eager reporters. "Nathan Kingston, do you have anything to say about the charges?" one journalist screamed, her voice cutting through the cacophony of shutters clicking in rapid succession. Nathan Kingston stepped out, flanked by federal agents, his wrists bound in steel cuffs. His face, stoic and unreadable, betrayed none of the storm brewing beneath. Dressed in a plain charcoal suit that carried neither the tailored sharpness of his gangster days nor the luxury of his past life, he walked with the weight of a fallen king. The truth was finally out, not just to the law enforcement agencies that hunted him for years or to the rivals he'd crushed, but to the city he once ruled with an iron fist. For Chicago, this was no ordinary criminal on trial. This was mythology unraveling in real time. Nathan Kingston wasn't just another name in a docket list. He was the chess master, a symbol of power, legacy, ambition, and now, defeat. His arrest wasn't just national news. It was an event that rippled through every street he once controlled, every politician he once owned, and every family his actions had forever scarred. The weight of the truth. The charges were staggering, laid out in a list so detailed it seemed unreal. Racketeering, money laundering, extortion, drug trafficking, arms smuggling, conspiracy to commit murder, direct involvement in the massacre of over 25 men tied to Billy Crowder's syndicate, and perhaps the gravest of all in the eyes of the public, the kidnapping of a politician's son, a crime Nathan never committed but was implicated in because of his organization's retaliation spree. Prosecutors seized the opportunity with ruthless determination. In their opening statements, they painted Nathan as a man of ambition so unrelenting, so callous, that even his family had been dragged into the violent empire he built. They showcased a digital mountain of evidence, financial records from offshore accounts, grainy surveillance footage of Nathan's lieutenants during raids, wiretapped conversations that hinted at orchestrated murders. When the photos of the Royal Lux massacre were displayed, bullet-ridden walls, blood-soaked carpets, a hush fell over the courtroom, the air heavy with the weight of undeniable violence. What struck the public the most wasn't just the breadth of Nathan's empire but the precision with which he ruled it. One prosecutor declared dramatically, "This wasn't just a criminal syndicate. This was the systematic manipulation of an entire city, puppeteered by a man who believed himself untouchable." But the trial wasn't just about evidence or legal wrangling, it was about the people who bore the scars of Nathan's ascent, the faces of the fallout. One after another, victims took the stand, families of men whose lives had been consumed in Nathan's bloody chess game against Billy Crowder. A widow sobbed as she clutched the photograph of her husband, a dock worker caught between rivals in a smuggling war he never chose to fight. A former employee of the Royal Lux testified about how Nathan's men forced silence through intimidation, how the hotel was transformed into a hub for criminal activity while the city looked the other way. But it wasn't just strangers who came forward. Marie Kingston, Nathan's unwavering partner, found herself dragged into the courtroom spotlight. She sat in the gallery, her usual grace maintained, but everyone could see the cracks forming in her stoic facade. When called to the stand, she maintained composure, though her voice trembled under the weight of the questions. "Did you know about your husband's involvement in these activities? Did you ever benefit from the crimes he committed?" "No," she would answer, her voice firm but brittle. "I knew he ran things, important things. But I loved the man, not his business. I stayed for our daughter." The moment of reckoning came when the courtroom fell silent, and Amy Kingston, a girl once shielded from her father's underworld, walked to the stand. By now she was almost unrecognizable from the fragile child whose abduction had sparked unfathomable retaliation. She spoke reluctantly, her voice quiet but weighted. "I don't think my father ever meant for me to understand what kind of man he was," Amy said, her eyes fixed on her hands. "But I did. I always knew in pieces. I didn't want to believe it. He thought he was protecting us. But how can you protect someone with destruction all around you?" Her words hung in the air, reverberating like stones tossed into the still waters of the courtroom. The betrayals within. Throughout the trial, the weight of Nathan's actions felt heavier with every testimony, every shred of evidence brought to light. Yet, Amidst the fiery condemnations, Nathan sat stone-faced as if calculating his next move in the great game of survival. But even he couldn't predict the biggest blow of all: betrayal from within his inner circle. Marco Iron Leone, the right-hand man who had stood by Nathan through decades of blood and power, had turned. Arrested shortly after Nathan's capture, Marco faced imminent life imprisonment. But to save what little was left of himself, Marco struck a deal with the prosecution. Sitting in the witness stand, Marco's presence was as brutal and imposing as ever. But for the first time in his life, his loyalty was placed somewhere other than Nathan. "We built something," Marco testified, his voice low and gruff. "Something unstoppable. But Nathan pushed too far. When you bring your family into it, when you start a war like that over your daughter, you leave no other choices. He destroyed Crowder, sure, but he destroyed us too." Facing Marco's betrayal was the one moment that stirred Nathan into breaking his silence. As Marco exited the stand, Nathan fixated on him, his eyes cold as steel but brimming with hatred. His voice, speaking for the first time since his trial began, was heard faintly by those closest nearby. "You just signed your death warrant." But the threat wasn't what it used to be. Nathan's influence had crumbled. The price of power. In the closing days of the trial, Nathan exhibited a rare vulnerability. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts, he didn't rage, didn't lash out. Instead, he sat in silence, his eyes staring forward as though looking through the walls of the courtroom and into a distant past. For Nathan, the sentencing was almost unnecessary. The life sentences alone assured he'd never again walk the streets as a free man. But it wasn't the bars that defined his punishment. It was the loss of everything he had fought to protect. His daughter Amy would grow up forever scarred by his choices. His wife Marie drifted further from him with every court proceeding. His empire, once vast, was scattered in the wind, leaving only whispers of its legacy in the alleyways of Chicago. In a letter written to Amy from his cell, Nathan's words revealed the truth that even he had denied for so long. "I did it all for you, Amy. Every gamble, every deal, every violent night. It was to keep you safe, to give you a life without fear, and in the end I see now, I was the one you should have been most afraid of." Legacy, built on ashes, Nathan Kingston's trial came to symbolize more than the fall of a crime lord. It became a reckoning for a city long complicit in its underworld dealings. Political figures who once took bribes from Kingston found themselves under investigations of their own. Former police chiefs who had turned a blind eye during his reign were brought to questioning. But for some, Nathan remained larger than life. To those who lived in the shadows of Chicago's streets, the chess master's name would always carry weight. They whispered of his brilliance, his ruthlessness, and the empire he built brick by bloody brick. But even those whispers carried a cautionary tale. No king, they'd say, can keep the crown forever. In the end, Nathan Kingston paid the ultimate price, not just in years behind bars but in the lives of those he loved, the empire he lost, and the solitude of a legacy bathed in blood.